Sasha Professor Thomas Schneider, Azani Akshami and So thank you very much for coming to the lecture of Professor Thomas Schneider today. Professor Thomas Schneider from the University of British Columbia in Canada is a leading historian of ancient Egypt and an expert in Semitic words in ancient Egypt. So one of his earliest books was a list of Semitic names in Egyptian texts. And these two lines of interest, history and Semitic words, Semitic names in Egyptian texts, led to a significant body of work about foreigners in ancient Egypt, mostly foreigners who came from the Levant, and about contacts between Egypt and the Levant. And this is probably how many of you have come in contact with his impressive scholarly work. And for many years, he's also been investigating Egyptology in Germany in the Nazi period, and in recent years, he's also become very involved in the study of the Hebrew Bible. Professor Thomas Schneider studied Egyptology, wrote his doctorate, and did his habilitation at the University of Basel in Switzerland. He was professor of the University of Swansea for 3 years, from 2005 to 2008, and he's been professor at the University of British Columbia for 10 years. He actually also managed to be professor at the University of Heidelberg for 6 years. He's had a very active career, and he's currently on a year's leave, but in fact he is also during this year filling an important administrative post at the University of Sussex in China. And in addition to this, he has an impressive record of activity in all his research fields. He has founded the Journal of Egyptian History. He has been editor of Near Eastern Archaeology, of Brill's series Culture and History of the Ancient Near East, and of the popular German Egyptology journal Markt. He was in recent years, he was amongst the editors of a conference volume on Old Kingdom history, another volume on ethnic identities in ancient Egypt, a book on Egyptology in Germany from the First World War to the Nazis, a key conference volume on recent scholarship of the Exodus, which many of you know and some of you contributed to, and another volume on ancient Egypt and the environment, which came out last year. So he's also involved in very cutting edge and very contemporary research. He's working now on, amongst other things, a new history of ancient Egypt centered on the role of the Nile, a new grammar of Middle Egyptian, and a book on Germany during the Nazi period. He's actually in Israel as a guest of the Department of Archaeology and the Halbert Center for Canadian Studies, both at EPU, where he's been giving a linguistic workshop. He will be giving one more lecture tomorrow on Egyptology during the Nazi period, so you can get a spoiler for his book. And on Thursday, he will be lecturing at the Albright. But today, we have him all to ourselves at Tel Aviv, and he is going to speak on a topic which combines several areas which are dear to him and in which he is an expert: Egypt and the Near East across the ages, a view through the lens of language contact. And he will speak for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll have a discussion. So please think of lots of interesting questions to ask after. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and it's such a pleasure to be here. So it's such a pleasure to be here at Tel Aviv University, and I'm really enjoying my stay here. I want to give you an overview of the variety and diversity of language contact between ancient Egypt and the Near East. I fear my script is too long, possibly for the 1 hour, but I later can also go quickly through some of the slides or so you have like a fulsome idea of everything. So language contact between ancient Egyptian and Semitic, as well as other ancient Near Eastern languages, must have been a ubiquitous phenomenon. Ancient Egypt was at all times, let us give you here the largest possible picture, was at all times in direct or mediated contact with neighboring and more distant linguistic areas, received significant numbers of immigrants, and during certain periods of its history controlled regions outside its traditional borders, or was itself subject to foreign rule. The cohabitation of speakers of different languages in Egypt, the migration and transfer of people, the trade of objects and the exchange of ideas was accompanied by language contact and linguistic interference, reflected in the transcription of names, the borrowing of words, the translation of texts, development of script systems, and the creation of interlanguages. Despite the likely omnipresence of language contact and linguistic interference, only a small fraction of it is actually attested, visible to us, and can be studied as a consequence of the limitations of the preserved written evidence and our inability to study spoken languages and communication from those times. 3 examples may serve to illustrate the situation. I'll give you just 3 examples to illustrate the difficulties. The massive state-induced settlement of people from the Levant and the Eastern Nile Delta from 2000 BC onward, culminating in the 15th dynasty rule of the Hyksos, is almost exclusively known to us from the material culture at the site of Awaris Tel Daba, that shows the hybridization or creolization of Egyptian and Levantine cultures. It produced without doubt intense language contact on different levels, including bilingualism, code switching, and maybe something like a pidgin language. For a related area, the site of Naucratis in the first millennium, scholars of Naucratis have actually suggested that the merchants who were living at the site must have developed a kind of pidgin language, as it is, of course, attested in many trade emporiums across the world. And another scholar, Carsten Heust, he has worked on, has identified a Nubian language variety of Egyptian that shows influences by a substrate language in the first millennium. However, the only remaining linguistic evidence for the contact situation in Awaris Tel Daba is the attestation of Northwest Semitic, maybe Amorite names, in conjunction with Egyptian titles and names on seals and other artifacts. So this is how little is remaining from the linguistic the diversity that we can assume. Then a second problem, evidence on language contact is more abundant in some periods, for example the Egyptian New Kingdom, than others, a fact that does not necessarily mean more intense contact, but it also reflects the preservation of documents and the emergence of new textual genres. I'll just give you an example. The ratio of the number of foreign personal names attested for individuals living in the Middle Kingdom, as opposed to those in the New Kingdom, is about 1 to 3. So it is not dramatically different and indicates a similar degree of language contact. However, if you look at the loanwords, the ratio is 1 to 100. 100 times more loanwords attested in New Kingdom as opposed to Middle Kingdom. For example, one of the reasons is that the large number of New Kingdom terms is attested on Ostraca papyri, for which we have only attestations mostly in the New Kingdom. So these are new surfaces of writing. But even so present problems of factual assessment. For example, among the Semitic loanwords in New Kingdom documents, terms relating to warfare and military equipment account for the largest portion, and we will see a bit later, even though we do not actually have any of the war documents of ancient Egypt, like manuals of warfare, etc., or specific documents of the military administration. And with those documents, then we would have even more such loanwords. And many of the loanwords attested from military war, from the military sphere, are hapax legomena, so they are only attested once, right? So you see how fragile the attestation is in this part of the documentation. Maybe cases of code switching only by the scribes who wrote them down. And then, of course, we also have to see that the attestation, or this is just an example here of some of the loanwords in Egyptian. I will come back to many of these later. And the third problem is that information on the languages involved in language contact can be deficient or missing. Just give you here examples of Hurrian, which is still one of the better known Near Eastern languages, but of course knowledge is deficient. And for example, for the case of Amorite, an old Semitic language of the 2nd millennium, the entire language itself is only reconstructed from names, right? We don't have Amorite text documents. So here we have a deficient evidence that we use to explain an even more deficient situation on the Egyptian side. And then we have other problems that relate to identifying terms, for example, the different phonologies used. And here it is, for example, still quite a startling fact that Egyptology uses a transcription system from Egyptian that dates back to the late 19th century and that was really designed because on the basis of what symbols produced on typewriters in the late 19th century, but has little correlates in the Semitic phonological system. So I just give you a brief overview here, and I want to start very early in the 4th millennium BCE, where the presence of immigrants from the Levant and Egypt has been ascertained at sites of the so-called Lower Egyptian culture of Buto and Mahdi, and vice versa, we have Egyptian presence in the southern Levant at sites such as in Bezoar and others. I just give you a number of examples here. So the introduction of the copper industry to Egypt and specific forms of settlements or housing or so that are particular to the Levant and show up in Egypt, testifying to contact with minorities or with populations from that region, and vice versa. We have, of course, also massive evidence for the presence of Egyptians in the Levant. So we have the material evidence for contact between groups of different speakers of different languages, but what is missing is, of course, the linguistic attestation of what this actually meant. So while intense cultural innovation from southern Mesopotamia in art, craftsmanship, architecture, and maybe the domain of writing is visible in Egypt before 3000 BCE, and it may be mediated through the physical presence of individuals from those regions, cases of linguistic interference with the Near East have only rarely been discussed. And I'll just give you, as I mentioned here, we have, of course, depictions of prisoners, right? As early as we have artistic depictions from Egypt, the prisoner motif is frequent, and this is possibly an ideological motif here, but certainly we have to assume that there were captives that were brought to Egypt, and this also must have resulted in some kind of linguistic contact. Concrete examples from this early time are rare, and one of the most intriguing ideas is to see the Egyptian royal title Nezu as a borrowing from Sumerian Ensi. So Nezu was pronounced, at least in the New Kingdom, as something like Insi. So I once suggested this in a footnote, but I wasn't courageous enough to develop the idea. So Carsten Koist then never picked up on this. And scholars have suggested for the development of archaic Egyptian, pre-Old Egyptian of the 4th millennium, the existence of different linguistic communities. As you know, or many of you know, ancient Egyptian, of course, is part of the Afro-Asiatic large group of languages. It shares features that are also present in Old Semitic languages, but other features that relate it to African languages. And the question is, how did this language come into existence, and how can we actually classify this archaic Egyptian? So here a number of scholars have suggested that this is a result of the merger of different population groups that then would have created this language. Some scholars have also made connections between Egyptian and other language macro families such as Indo-European. For example, Frank Hammartzell in Berlin has compared the Egyptian stative, a grammatical feature of the Egyptian language system, with an Indo-European feature, namely the median perfect, and has suggested that this might have happened through a substrate language or a Sprachbund situation where there was some kind of contact between speakers of those languages, which I don't really believe so much, but it is just an example of the ideas, right, that have surrounded this topic. In this regard, more likely, also outside the purpose of this paper, is very substantial and extensive language contact between ancient Egyptian and African languages, and some scholars have pointed to many parallels between features of the Egyptian language system and African languages. Then if you move into, I'll just give you here an example, if you move into into the late 4th millennium, the 3rd millennium, Egyptian contact with speakers of Near Eastern languages is actually attested in Egypt, abroad, and also in the East Delta border zone. And here it is important to account for the fact that Egypt was not as purely Egyptian as the Egyptian official documentation wants us to believe. So the Eastern Nile Delta was likely populated by speakers of a Semitic language in the early Bronze Age. There was a very fuzzy situation of overlap, right, of Egyptian and Semitic speakers. In the Western Delta, we know the presence of Libyan, early Berber tribes, right? In the south, we have the presence of different Nubian languages, right? So the idea that we have a strictly demarcated Egyptian territory is rather a construct of Egyptian ideology than a reflection of reality. So, for example, some scholars like Manfred Itak have suggested that temples in the Eastern Nile Delta, such as at Tel Ibrahim Awad, bear evidence of structural evidence or similarities to Levantine temples. And we have some interesting facts like the god Soktu, who was in historical times the patron god of the 20th Egyptian nome in the southeastern delta. He continued to be portrayed, as you see here, as an Asiatic. Egyptologists speak about Asiatics when they actually think of Palestinians or Levantine people, right? It's certainly a certain kind of misnomer. But here you see Soktu, the god Thet of the foreign lands, and behind him with a beard and a specific kilt and feathers or so, we see the god Soktu as depicted as a foreigner. And still in the New Kingdom, the Ramesside capital city of Pyramese on the Pelusiac branch of the Nile was said to be, I quote, a praise of the Delta residents from Papyrus Nasazi II. It was said to be situated between Palestine and Egypt, but here we are basically in the Eastern Nile Delta, right? So there was a clear awareness of the Egyptians that this Eastern Delta was a zone of mixed cultural and linguistic, possibly, population. And a recently published Ostrakon speaks about the same Delta residents in the Eastern Nile Delta as the outpost of every foreign country and the hinterland of Egypt, right? The Egyptians were looking towards the south, and the hinterland was the Eastern Nile Delta that was called Palestine. Beyond the border zone, Egyptian Semitic language contact in the Old Kingdom is implicitly plausible by Egypt's activity on the Sinai Peninsula and its entertainment of a policy of political, military, and commercial engagement in the Levant, whose extent has only recently become more apparent. I'll just give you here a number of examples. Karin Sowada has studied the material evidence for the very intense, it seems, interaction of the Egyptian state of the Old Kingdom. And we have an increasing number of expedition inscriptions from expedition leaders or so. This is one inscription I studied, and where I think that it even mentions expeditions to Lebanon in the Old Kingdom. This has not always been seen as possible by Egyptologists, but Egyptologists are always informed by the evidence we have and not what actually is imaginable or is realistic, because there's no reason to think why the pyramid builders of the Great Pyramids should not have ventured right into Palestine or so, and should not have engaged in the most widespread activities abroad. So this is well attested here. We also know that, of course, the Lebanese port city of Byblos served as Egypt's commercial gateway to Syria in the Old Kingdom already, where the Egyptian administration cooperated closely with the city's chieftains, and where knowledge of Egyptian and religious exchange is actually attested. For example, we have Egyptian inscriptions here, we have the identification of the local lady of Byblos, the local goddess, maybe an Astarte-type goddess with Egyptian harp, etc. And we know that in the 5th and 6th dynasty, here we have the depiction of the capture, the conquest of what seems to be Palestinian towns by Egypt. We have reference in biographies of the Old Kingdom to such military events and to prisoners, for example, and this continues into the First Intermediate period. The teaching of Mary Carré speaks about the incursion of Asiatics into the Eastern Nile Delta. So a number of situations where we can infer that there was intense linguistic contact. So this is just to give you a number of examples here. Language contact in these times is attested and reflected in the transcription of foreign terms and names since earliest times already. And I just give you here one example. This is from an ivory label of King Devon or Den in the First Dynasty, first time of smiting the East, possibly an ideological inscription here, not necessarily historical. And here we have three hieroglyphs, S, T, M, and N, that I once tried to explain as either Thu Taimani, he of Teman, the Southland, or Ifu Taimani, the man of Teman. Maybe that is not the truth, but at least it's an idea. I haven't really found many other people commenting on what this should mean, if it was an Indian name or so. But in principle, there is no reason to believe that the Egyptians would not have had a way to render foreign names, of course, in the hieroglyphic system, right? This need must have arisen as early as there were contacts, right? And there must have been a way to transliterate or transcribe these names in Egyptian. So a developed such transcription system is then first attested in the 6th dynasty on several series of execration texts preserved from the Memphite royal residences and directed against Nubian individuals from the south, possibly from auxiliary troops. While the African linguistic material is outside of what I want to speak about today, the system was probably in use for Semitic and other Eastern languages too, but the Nubian evidence allows us to see that this system allowed for a detailed graphophonemic and graphomorphometic analysis, and it shows that the Egyptian comprehension of foreign lexemes was widely advanced. For example, they used the classifier hieroglyph dog for terms that seem to have meant dog in the Nubian languages. Possible, and then this is just a recent monograph that has been published on all the evidence we have from the 3rd millennium that seems to be from Africa in the widest sense, so names but also terms. And then this is from one of my earlier articles or so, where I tried to show that the name of what seems to be a Lebanese deity or so mentioned several times in the pyramid texts, like here, and also on Asil from Byblos could be an associative transcription of a local divine name, Aftaro, star god from the Levant. And the Egyptians would have used Egyptian terms that were similar in their phonological value, but would also have had a meaning in Egyptian. This transcription actually means who appears burning, so they would have found an associative rendering of the name that actually also explained the character of that divine entity. Then we have depictions of seagoing ships from the funerary temple of Sahure and the causeway of Unas that depict also translators that accompanied the Levantine and Egyptian crew members. And there is no reason to doubt that the court of the Old Kingdom was in diplomatic contact with political and trade centers in the Near East. The singular clay tablets, one of the most exciting finds made in recent years in Egypt, in the western oasis of Ain Asil Balad, the center of governors. These very unique for Egypt clay tablets were found. Very difficult to inscribe in Egyptian hieratic because it's a different medium. But I think the most likely explanation is that these clay tablets were formed on the basis of the knowledge that clay tablets actually existed in the Middle East. It was an attempt made by these governors, and then it was abandoned because it wasn't very practical for the Egyptian writing system, but it would provide indirect evidence that the Egyptian state of the Old Kingdom was aware of the existence of cuneiform tablets. And again, there is no reason to believe that the kings of the Old Kingdom would not have exchanged letters with their counterparts like Sargon and Atali and other kings of the Middle East. So conversely, the similarity of signs of the undeciphered Byblos script with some Egyptian hieratic signs of the later Old Kingdom, has been suggested to show influence of Egyptian writing on the development of the local script system. And recently, it also has been suggested by Richard Steiner, this was released a couple of years ago by the Hebrew University, that some pyramid spells from the Old Kingdom show a rendering of Semitic serpent spells in a form of early Semitic. I think that in principle this is a possibility, although I think the concrete case, as it was made here by Richard Steiner, is possibly doesn't hold true, because he uses phonological values of a much later time that cannot have been in existence in the Old Kingdom. So we have some evidence increasing in the 3rd millennium when it comes to lexical transfer. This is really still rare. One example might be the important word for horse. In Egyptian, the word is sesemet. It includes an R, an M in the core, the stem of the word, but clearly the M is an ending, right? In the 3rd millennium, it is a so-called mimation of Semitic languages, which was possibly misperceived as part of the word by the Egyptians, and so became borrowed. And there is another feature here about the S sound, the sibilant, that seems to indicate that this word must have been borrowed very early, so approximately around 2100 BCE, which would be quite exciting because it would predate the first attestation of the horse in terms of skeletons by hundreds of years, right? But again, there is no reason to believe that the Egyptians would not have known about the existence of horses much earlier than they are actually attested. So if we move into the Middle Kingdom, the Second Intermediate Period, there we have an increasing number of evidence of both contact with the Levant and also language contact. So first, such linguistic contact can be deduced implicitly from the extent of political and cultural interaction. Within the last 25 years, there has been increasing evidence come up that for wide-ranging Egyptian engagement with the Near East. In the Middle Kingdom, most famously these annals of Amenemhet II from Mitrahine close to Memphis that speaks about the conquest by Egypt of Cyprus and of a region in southeastern Anatolia, something that wasn't believed to be possible before. And we also have a new inscription by a dignitary Khnumhotep from a mastaba at Dashur that presents Egypt as a mediator in political affairs in the Levant. Again, it seems that Egypt was more present than was previously believed. There's also a cuneiform tablet from Tel Siano that refers to trade relations between Egypt and Cyprus in the Middle Kingdom. Intense commercial and cultural contact can be inferred from Levantine commodities in Egypt and Egyptian products in Palestine and Syria, of course. So again, the material evidence is there, but we do not have so much evidence on the linguistic side. We have the presence of Egyptian scarabs in the Levant and their emulation, both in the Levant and in Crete, which highlights the popularity of the amulet. But the amulet was also a medium to disseminate Egyptian ideas, right, and even elements of the language. In turn, Levantine, Mesopotamian, and 18 concepts and motifs were also transferred to Egypt. I just give you here an example from Beni Hassan, one of these famous tombs of governors in Middle Egypt, where we have fabulous beasts or so depicted, griffins and other beasts. We also have scenes of bull leaping here, or the Mesopotamian tree of life. So these are like surface phenomena in the artistic inventory, and we have to assume that this also came with linguistic interaction. But this linguistic and scribal interaction is much less visible, but at least we have in the early 12th dynasty, of course, the famous tale of Sinuhe. Sinuhe is a fictional protagonist of the story of Sinuhe, an Egyptian refugee who rises in the Levant to the position of chieftain and controls trade and diplomatic travel. This text mentions explicitly that speakers of Egyptian were residents of the Levant. This story also has the local sheikh who adopts Sinue into his family, speak in Egyptian to Sinue, whether directly or indirectly is not said in the text. And it implicitly credits Sinue with the acquisition of the local Semitic language when he establishes a family for himself and builds his career. So again, the texts are very silent on these aspects, right, of linguistic interaction, maybe because it was so widespread, right? It wasn't really an issue. For Egyptian careers abroad, I'm going to give you here a different text or so from the Middle Kingdom. We have a number of papyri that speak about adventures abroad. For example, a priest of Sakhmet that wandered abroad in a papyrus in Moscow, or here in papyrus in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the story about a merchant who ventured to Byblos and possibly had some misfortunes at Byblos. So, you know, this is an emerging landscape of engagement abroad, and all these people must have interacted also linguistically. So language contact was inevitable for all these people, and mutual Egyptian Semitic language competency indispensable. The Khnumhotep inscription from Dashur that I mentioned before renders communication between an Egyptian expedition leader and the ruler of Byblos. And interestingly, it also mentions speakers of Egyptian. And what is quite fascinating here you have the term Egyptians, Kemetiu, one of these ships of the Egyptians there. And the term for Egyptians is Kemetiu. Normally you have a seated man and a seated woman as a determinative or classifier for people, right? Like in the Israel in the Memorandum Taxtili. But here the main figure is buried and it raises its hand to the mouth, which is like the speaking classifier, right? So here we're not dealing with Egyptians, but with Egyptian speakers, right? It's a very ingenious, adaptation of the classifier sign here to express this idea. We know that Egyptians' Asiatic or Palestinian forecourt, the Sinai Peninsula, was the destination of mining expeditions throughout the Middle Kingdom, in which local personnel was employed and possibly bilingual Asic Egyptians were put in charge as expeditions leaders. One of the most famous examples here is this person called Ameni. It is said here, who was made by an Asiatic or Palestinian woman. So clearly this is here indicated in the inscription, that he was from Levantine background. He also has this pointed beard here. It is a marker of his identity. On a funerary stele preserved from the Middle Kingdom, a dignitary by the name of Hetep-Rechu in the early 12th dynasty claims that he was able to, I gave you here the Egyptian text, to interpret the language of any foreign country, the one who unties or interprets the languages of all foreign countries. In turn, the annals from King Amenemhet II from Mitrahini that I mentioned before report prisoners who were captured for the king's pyramid city and given as a tribute. But in addition, provide the singular information, I think so far unique from that early in Egypt, that the Egyptian soldiers ate the Asiatic dishes of the prisoners, so a kind of first symposium mentioned here, right? And you just imagine these people sitting together around the same table, and they must have communicated with each other. Large numbers of workers from the Levant, often with Semitic names, are attested at the major Middle Kingdom pyramid construction sites, such as Ilahun. They are also attested in private households. And I'll just give you here famous examples. The Papyrus Brooklyn 351446 mentions a total of 47 people with foreign Semitic names, Northwest Semitic names, and other funerary stelae very often mention clusters of people, possibly servants that were assigned to certain households. And there we again can infer that this must have created like micro-linguistic groups, right? Speaking clusters in those households. The most prominent settlement of people from the Levant on Egyptian soil that I mentioned before is, of course, the famous site of Tel Daba Awaris, where we see massive immigration. Such immigration in the Middle Kingdom is actually attested. Here we have a group of maybe nomads or so. The leader has the title of Hyksos also in this inscription at Beni Hassan, moving into Egyptian, possibly employed by the governor of Beni Hassan. On the southern border, the Nubian border, we have even rests of a papyrus that was part of like the border officials, right, documenting the entry to Egypt of all those people. We must imagine at the border fortresses, such records were kept, of course, for all those immigrating or emigrating people, right? But we don't have them, right? If we have these kilometers and kilometers of text that would give us invaluable evidence, right, on the flux of populations here between the different countries. But at the site of Avaris Teledaba alone, the most prominent site of the Middle Bronze Age culture in Egypt, that was settled from the early 12th dynasty on, founded as a pioneer settlement by the Egyptian state. The state offered those people work and employment in Egypt in a very hostile environmental environment, high mortality of people, average age of mortality is about 19 years or so for those people who were initially employed here. But for this town alone, Manfred Wietak, its excavator, has estimated the number of Canaanite inhabitants during the 18th and 17th centuries at any time at circa 30,000 people, right? So you just see the number of people that we have to imagine. Now this is only for one site. There's no reason to believe that large cities, mega cities of Egypt like Memphis, had a lesser population, right, of people from abroad. So this creates a totally different scenario, right, of tens of thousands, maybe more people in Egypt at any given time that must have brought their languages and linguistic cultures to Egypt. So it is obvious that Northwest Semitic must have represented an important minority language in the Middle Kingdom and the Second Intermediate Period Egypt, creating within Egypt a situation of intense linguistic interference. Now, Middle Kingdom texts from official and private sources use a coherent subsystem of the hieroglyphic script to render foreign names and words, with matres lectiones after monoconsonantal signs for the rendering of the vowels U and I. And I just brought you here one name, Hatzor. This is the rendering in the Middle Kingdom, where you see one consonant for the Ch, and then you see for the C sound, you have the cobra, the serpent. Then you have a mater lectiones, basically a vowel indicator, the W. And then you have the lead leaf, which is again an indicator possibly of a transition to the R sound, and the vulture sign is the R. In the New Kingdom, just compare, even if you are not fluent in Middle Egyptian or Late Egyptian or so, just compare how different the two writings are. You see that in the New Kingdom, hardly any hieroglyph is the same as in the Middle Kingdom, so there was a transition to a very different assessment of transcription between the Middle and the New Kingdoms. But the idea is that in the Middle Kingdom, possibly the state administration had developed a very stringent and reliable system to render these foreign names. The most detailed use of this system is visible in the older and younger series of the Middle Kingdom execration texts. I give you here an illustration, both figurines, but also bowls that served to magically prevent the rebellion, both of Egyptians, but also of foreign potential enemies to the state. And they give us, in this very detailed, precise transcription system, one of the earliest precise sources for the settlement of the Levant, as you know, and for some of its kings and chieftains. So this onomasticon, together with about 200 Semitic personal names preserved in other sources, and most of those names I discussed in my PhD thesis, constitutes an important secondary tradition for Northwest Semitic. We know that, or we can assume that written communication with the Near East in Egyptian or cuneiform existed. It would be foolish to assume that it didn't exist. But we have only one recently found fragment of a letter sent to the residents of the Hyksos at Avaris by one of the last kings of the first dynasty of Babylon. So I just want to give you here an idea of what the huge amount of what we do not have preserved. We have this 2 centimeter broken piece of a cuneiform tablet, and that's everything that is left from maybe thousands or tens of thousands of tablets, that we can assume the kings of the Middle Kingdom exchanged with their many counterparts in the Levant and in Mesopotamia, right? There's no reason to believe they did not communicate with each other, but everything is lost. Conversely, at Egypt's trade emporium, Byblos, on the Lebanese coast, the local rulers adopted the Egyptian title Mer, Mer of Byblos, and appeared to be Egyptianized. They adopted the hieroglyphic script for the official stelae and reliefs in which their names appear in Egyptian transcription. We also see Egyptian hieratic writing used at Byblos. For example, there is a stele that is called pseudo-hieroglyphic stele L, where one scholar, James Hawke, surmised that it might have been an attempt to adopt by the Biblian population or the court Egyptian elements of the Egyptian writing system. Egyptian inscriptions also appear as legends on some seals from the Middle Bronze Age Levant. And just want to give you here two particularly interesting examples where I think the inscription shows to us that there was a deep understanding of the Mesopotamian script system. The first seal here seems to provide a transcription of the Sumerogram Ir, so a divine name with a Sumerian classifier sign, and the Ir seems actually to be written out in hieroglyphs here, Ir. So this would be the Yana transcription system in the Middle Kingdom. And in the other seal, we have a description of a deity that seems to be the god Horus. The name of the god Horus was pronounced as something like Haru in the Middle Kingdom. I hope I did it well. And behind it, we have the rendering in Egyptian hieroglyphs of the god named Hadu. So the god Hadu and the god Haru, Horus, would be like the closest possible approximations of two deities, right? So the Egyptians could be seen here as playing with the idea that the gods would be close in their nature and could be also approximated by their names. So the Egyptian monumental and cursive writing systems seem to have prompted several but unsuccessful attempts by speakers of Northwest Semitic to design a script system for their indigenous languages. As you know, we have the Byblos script that I mentioned before, we have the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions, exemplified here, and we have these two lines of the Wadi al-Hol inscriptions that were found about 20 or so years ago by John Darnell in the Western Desert, west of Thebes. So these might be all attempts to create an indigenous writing system, but all of these attempts were not successful. Despite this intense contact and the assumed transfer of technological innovation to Egypt in the first half of the second millennium, lexical interference is only rarely attested. And I'll just give you a number of possible examples here. So one of the oldest borrowings is the word afbad for quiver from the Middle Kingdom, and then we might have some other words. I once suggested that the Hittite word viduli was borrowed by the Egyptian word vererit, which was similarly pronounced in the Middle Kingdom. And then recently, a colleague of mine has suggested that some words that show up late in the Egyptian evidence, for example, only in Coptic, might actually go back to very early loans, but we simply do not have these early loans in Egyptian so far. Northwest Semitic, in return, may have borrowed a word like the word Hebrew dio for ink from the Egyptian counterpart. Again, the R sound in the Middle Kingdom was something like a D sound. And you have the yod and the T had been dropped by the Egyptians by the Middle Kingdom. So it was something like the Ya or so in the Middle Kingdom. So this seems still a very convincing to me etymology. And there may be other early borrowings, again, words of administration or so that might go back at least to the Middle Kingdom in Egypt. And some years ago, I also suggested that in the story of Sinue from the 12th dynasty. There might even be a non-Semitic loanword here, a Luwian title, Kantawati's ruler, that has been picked up by some scholars because at the time the southern coast of Anatolia was settled by speakers of Luwian. So there is maybe some evidence here, but it's still very limited. The first half of the second millennium is marked by an enormous increase in the evidence about Near Easterners in ancient Egypt, who are attested throughout this whole socioeconomic and professional spectrum, from prisoners of war and compulsory workers to cultic and priestly functions, high administrative offices and royalty. As I mentioned before, the most prominent site for this interrelationship of Egypt and the Levant is again Awaris Tel Daba, where kings of Palestinian descent rose to power after the end of the Middle Kingdom, and these so-called Hyksos used Egyptian writing for governance and monumental display, much like the Amorite kings of Syria and Mesopotamia used Akkadian and not their indigenous language of Amorite for administration official purposes. And on a scribal palette that you see here on the right side, given by the Hyksos king Aparpi to a scribe by the name of Achu, the king portrays himself as a model of erudition instructed by the god of wisdom Thoth and the goddess of writing Seshat. So that is something that Egyptologists for a long time didn't want to hear. Hyksos actually could have been much more erudite than Egyptians in the late second intermediate period. At the same time, the Hyksos, other contemporary rulers and dignitaries carried Amorite personal names that may reveal a situation of bilingualism. So, for example, here, the Hyksos Khairan, inscribed in the cartouche, is a Semitic name or so. All the names that you see here, Yinasi or so, are Semitic names, Sikru Hadu or so. But unfortunately, we have no clue as to the private language situation at the court of the Hyksos kings, right? We don't know to what extent they might have used Amorite or Egyptian. But the flourishing of Syrian cults, for example, the cult of Baal, is clearly attested at Tel Daba. This is from a cylinder seal, and around 1300 BCE, the Egyptians celebrated the 400th return of the introduction of the cult of Baal on Egyptian soil. This must, of course, have meant that there was, of course, a temple functioning, there was a priesthood, and these priests, of course, used ritual texts in Semitic languages, possibly to perform the cult. We don't have them, but can all be assumed. Now, if we move into the late Bronze Age and the New Kingdom, the evidence for language contact between Egyptian and Eastern languages changes dramatically in terms of the available quantity and diversity of sources, the multitude of attested phenomena of interference, and the range of Near Eastern languages with which contact is attested. More richly documented is also the cultural context of language contact in the New Kingdom. So lexical transfer in the Egyptian New Kingdom, approximately the second half of the second millennium BCE, is the best documented case for Egyptian Eastern language contact. And I'll just give you here a number, an overview of the categories, the types of text in which these loanwords are attested. Now, loanwords, of course, have different functions. They are lexical entities, but they are also cultural tokens. They can signify a number of different motivations for borrowings, starting from the gap of a suitable term in the indigenous language or so, but also other phenomena such as linguistic economy or communication reasons. For example, code switching of speakers who are more familiar with a certain term in a given communication situation, style and fashion, or social and ideological motivations such as prestige, erudition, or exotism. The range of use of loanwords affect their phonological, morphological, and semantic integration. For example, if you remember the word I just gave you on the previous slide, where it reads chariot, more possibly a borrowing in the Middle Kingdom. This word was fully integrated in Egyptian in the early New Kingdom, and appears in the New Kingdom in stylistic variation with a new borrowing, namely the word markabt. Markabt, of course, is the new term, Semitic term for chariot. In the late period, It assumes the meaning wagon cart for transport, so you see a shift of the meaning in markup, and so enters into competition with yet another Semitic loanword, namely agalat, Coptic apiolte, which also means wagon or cart for transportation. In Egyptian New Kingdom text, about 350 loanwords of probably or possibly Semitic origin are tested, to which about 300 loanwords of possibly non-Semitic origin can be added. In terms of the attestation of these words, it is important to notice that 2/3 of them are from texts of the elite culture. So what you see here, the wisdom text, onomastica, so name lists or verb lists, religious texts, autobiographies, and royal texts. And only 1/3 of these attestations come from texts that are close to the vernacular language, the spoken language in the street, letters, judicial, business, fiction, and lyric texts. The notation of these words uses a specialized Egyptian transliteration system, the so-called syllabic orthography, or also group writing. And this is at least one attempt by Wolfgang Helg from about 20 years ago to understand the system. The idea would be that the basic consonant, sometimes the basic consonant with the vulture sign that had lost its earlier R value, like English R, right, which is basically an R sound, would be used for the R vowel syllables. The addition of the double stroke would be a mater lectionis for the E value, the addition of W sign for the U value, etc. So this has been criticized by many scholars after this was published, pointing to exceptions to the rule. But I think we have to assume that we simply we don't have the manuals of court, right? If we had like the libraries from the palace or so, the instructions given to the scribes of how to officially transcribe the terms from abroad, we would possibly have a very rigid system in place, right? The hundreds of names and words we have, they come from all, walks of life, right? From all types of reliable and unreliable records, right? From over 200 years when the system might have changed, right? So it's very difficult from this very fuzzy situation to reconstruct the system that must underline the system original. I'm quite sure there was a stringent system in place, and I'll just give you here again as an idea the writing of Hatzor. So here groups, earlier biconsonantal signs were used to indicate syllabic values, the earlier Q sign, the Cha sign, the Ru sign. So complex signs that had a different function in earlier times were used now to indicate syllabic, what I assume are syllabic values, and also short Egyptian words like the word for wood, which was something like he or chi in the New Kingdom, were also used because they were suitable. Right, 5 minutes, okay. I thought I started 20 past, but I tried to be quick. So maybe I just, what I do is I could just give you, go briefly through some of the slides. I wanted to speak about the fact that, of course, now many more languages are tested. So we have not only Semitic languages, we have Hurrian and other languages attested in the text, also other Anatolian languages where specific varieties of this writing system could be attested. We see specific terms like chaba, business, trade attested, specialties of eating or food, right? So suddenly the evidence becomes very rich, right? The Egyptians here like this one very much, harashpante, the type of bread or cake made of meat or mushrooms, right? Like the specialty of the food culture. We see also some, this is quite exciting in description of the royal chariot. We see actually in the translation of a specific term, it says here their supports, Semitic root amat, are made of gold. Their boche, and this actually means the golden ones in Hurrian are made of gold, right? So here we see actually the translation of the Hurrian terms. So they had something about distribution. So we see here military is very present, right, in the attestation of terms. warfare, military right, but this is a coincidental situation of preservation that certainly doesn't necessarily reflect the entire situation in antiquity. We have different, of course, semantic categories or so in which we see loanwords attested. We can say more about the distribution of these terms, the attestation. Interestingly, most of the loanwords are hapax legomena, so that is attested once, which means we are basically left in the dark about, when they were imported and used, and whether these are coincidences of a scribe code switching to a term, or whether there is a universe of the use of the term hiding behind it. Interestingly, the most frequent terms in the Kingdom are words from Hurrian, from Semitic languages. Cousine, charioteer, the most widely one, and then possibly adjective gradient that is also tested with more than 120 tokens. So this is like the frequency of attestation, and we go briefly across. Then we have here an idea about different word, word groups or so, and how frequently they are tested. Nouns, most frequently, verbs less so, and hardly anything from other categories of words. There's one interesting article here, AZ, which that is very often used, but it seems to be used as a word that allowed the scribes to boast their erudition, right? They would always say, is there, right? Even in texts where this doesn't make much sense, because they wanted to boast how well acquainted they were with Semitic languages. And I just give you here one text from verse Anastasic 1. We don't really have to have the time to go through it, but you see just everything that is here in italics or so, NWS or so, is a foreign word, right? Even an entire sentence here in Semitic. This is possibly not a text that actually was spoken out or so, but it was a text that showed the erudition of the scribe, right? He just could put every word that he knew from those verses Semitic into this text, right? And this would just raise his social profile among the scribes. So we have also some text, only short text, entirely in Semitic. We have other languages attested, the famous text here in the language of Crete. Nobody actually knows what this spell means, but it is attested. We have then quite significant information about the cohabitation in the New Kingdom of foreigners. For example, here, excitingly at Pyramses, we have in situ still this Hittite shield mold. And we have to assume that in the high technology and high temperature area of the city or so, we have specialized workers from Anatolia or so working side by side with the Egyptians or so. And we can just extrapolate what this means in terms of the language communities. We have plenty of person names that are also selected, discussed in early work. I just wanted to mention, this comes much later or so, we have, of course, much evidence on an official level. We have, of course, attestation of concubines and wives of kings that came from Mitanni, from Hittite Empire, from abroad. We have to assume that those princesses came not only alone, but they came with an entourage and maybe even with a library or so of texts or so to Egypt. And this must have influenced, of course, the style of the Egyptian court culture. And we know, of course, of famous envoys, ambassadors, and professional specialists that were exchanged. Most famously, this is Nechawimes Pirichnava. He was known to us from the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty as the envoy who brought the peace treaty to the Hittites. And recently, Alan Zivi found the tomb of this envoy in Saqqara. So we now have the evidence for this person himself, so who was in charge of communicating, negotiating the peace treaty between the two nations. Most interestingly, in the peace treaty is the list of witness deities, right, that are translated into Egyptian from Hittite. So quite an extensive effort here made. We have not so many texts written entirely in foreign languages, but we have the adaptation of entire cycles of literature from the Levant. Will be coming to a close soon. So this is the first page of the so-called Astarte Papyrus. It is a text about the fight of the weather god against Yam, against the sea. The best parallel to this text is a Hittite Hurrian basic mythical text or so. So this shows that these texts were known in Egypt, and actually this is maybe they have been at the origin of the creation of the Egyptian novel in the New Kingdom, because all these long texts from the late 18th dynasty onward, they have models abroad. So this is quite exciting. And we see also in these texts that we have, this is from the Tale of the Two Brothers, that we have the calque of terms that were translated into Egyptian. The hero Bata of the Tale of the Two Brothers has the unusual Egyptian title Ahauti Nefer, perfect fighter, but in the Ugaritic text that might be underlying this Egyptian text, we have the qualification Ali Karadium, strongest of fighters, which might have been the model, right, the template for the Egyptian expression. Then just briefly in 5 or 6 slides, when we turn into the Iron Age, everything becomes very complex, of course. We have the Arameans moving into the Middle East, becoming the dominant language of communication and administration. We have complex situations like here after the end of the Hittite Empire, and I just mentioned a number of things here. I also wanted to briefly speak about Hebrew. We have a limited number of terms, of course, that seem to be of Egyptian origin. Hebrew, commodities, some technical terms, units of volume, elements, of course, of the Egyptian environment, etc. Some terms like khartoum that are specific in terms of a professional term. A limited number of terms that are tested here, and some people have claimed more terms that I've listed here, but that we cannot speak about. We have Egyptian loans into Egyptian Aramaic, but also a relatively small number. Of course, here we have the interesting situation of the Jewish community at the garrison of Elephantine, so a linguistic community of Elephantine, but often also in other places of Egypt. In Saqqara, there was a famous Jewish community too. Very intense documentation, as you all know. Other minorities from the Middle East are more rarely attested, like Phoenicians. We have some presence of people from the Arabian Peninsula attested. This is the most famous, like, coffin of a merchant Zaid Il with a Maimene inscription from Saqqara, but already in Hellenistic times. We have the Carian mercenaries, so an Anatolian-speaking population who were tested in these funerary stelae from Egypt. Here Egypt provides one of the most important source languages. And then in Persian times, surprisingly few Persian terms that are tested in Egyptian, actually only 3. And then we have monumental evidence of linguistic interaction. We have the large monumental stelae that were erected along the precursor of the Suez Canal, built by the Persians in 4 languages. And we also have small objects. This is a cosmetic jar at Yale that also includes an inscription in Persian, in Elamite, in Akkadian, and in Egyptian, including also a demotic term for actually the unit. And since I'm giving this lecture in Israel, I just want to mention that in the Bible Lands Museum in Jerusalem, there is a similar also vessel in 4 languages. And maybe I can just read my final sentence to bring this to an end. So these documents demonstrate not only the linguistic diversity of Persian period Egypt, but also in one object, the interface of language content in Egyptian life that eludes us so often